Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that we are introducing Tom Ryan to you all today as part of our Department of Landscape Architecture lecture series. And this one is extra special because we're doing this with the student chapter of the ASLA. So thank you to Rachel and everyone in student chapter for pitching in and helping us out. Yay! Go ASLA! I'd like to introduce, first of all, welcome to all of you, and to give Tom a chance to get a feel for who's here. How about all the graduate students? Raise your hands. And how about people in 5th year? Raise your hands. They cluster together, you know. It helps with the air. How about people in 4th year? All right. 3rd year? No 3rd year. One 3rd year. 2nd year? Upstairs working hard, except for a few in the back. Good. And 1st year? Yeah, all right. So welcome. There's a lot of faculty here as well. It's good to see you all. I'm going to introduce Tom as, first of all, one of the more remarkable landscape architects in practice in the United States right now. He's had a chance to make his expertise available to several firms that you may have heard of who were quick to jump at getting him on board. That includes Martha Schwartz, Stoss, New Urbanism, Hargraves, Sasaki, SWA, and the list goes on and on. Tom is the go-to person that gets all the projects built. He's worked with Carol Johnson, SWA, and Sasaki on the corporate headquarter projects in Cleveland, Frito-Lay. There's so many projects here. The Louisville waterfront park, which he's going to talk about. He's worked on Highline. He's worked on Fresh Kills, City Center in Las Vegas, and on projects in Qatar, China, and the UK. So Tom's 20 plus, 30 plus maybe years of practice have been very much focused on what we wish we could do a lot in landscape architecture, which is see the things get built. So Tom today is practicing in Boston. His firm specializes in design intention. He also teaches in the construction programs at University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. He wrote, as TA, contributed to Time Saver Standards for Landscape Architecture, which has become a kind of seminal work for all of us to understand how to do the details. And he just recently published this book. I tried to go to the library, but it's checked out. This is called Detailing for Landscape Architects. It is in the library, and it's also available for purchase from John Wiley. The interesting focus that Tom brings to detailing and construction is that he doesn't think design is over until he walks away from the site and it's been built. So design goes all the way through. It doesn't just stop at conceptual or the things that you do in studio. It's still going on through detailing, through the site work, through the implementation in the field, and so forth. So he brings an incredibly fresh perspective to the meaning of design to those of us who think that it stops at the very front end of conceptualization. I know Tom personally as a friend that I went to school with, and Tom was the one who taught me how to draw arrowheads. Everybody should have a skill. But most of us in that class learned quite a lot from Tom. He has his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin, where Martha went to school. No? Who went? Somebody went to school. But it was Chris. There we go. And he comes from a heritage of construction, Ryan construction, and apparently is somewhat related to the person who's currently running for vice president. But we won't go into details. So with that, if I could introduce Tom to you, it is on a URL. We're webcasting this lecture today. For those of you who are registered for continuing education credits, just please see me or contact me at the end, and we'll make sure you get those. Because it is URL, when we pass the microphone around for questions at the end, make sure you get the microphone so it can go on the web. Okay, so welcome, Tom.
I think I've got a mic. Does this work? Okay. Thank you, Jody. As Jody and I go way back, as she said, we had a very interesting class back in the last ice age. And I guess Jody's going to bring some other classmates in from time to time. But the point of that maybe is that a lot of your teachers, you're going to learn a lot from each other, and you're going to be in practice a long time. So keep in touch. You never know. You might get an invitation to speak in Muncie. You just never know. But the people you go to school with are a valuable resource, and you should all take advantage of that resource. Jody's asked me to speak a while ago, and then back a few weeks ago she said, well, we're dealing with water. Why don't you talk about water? Well, at that point I'd had a talk about detailing put together, and I said, oh gosh, I'm not going to talk about water. So I went back and kind of ripped my PowerPoint apart and tried to put it back together, and went out to some travel slides and water. What have I done with water? What do I know about water? And put together what I'm going to show you now, and hopefully it works. Landscape, it's always good to start with some history, so we put up some, landscape is about water at some level always. Water is needed to support plant material. Water is active. Water works. We live in a landscape that's nourished by water, destroyed by water. You go back to the ancient gardens, they oftentimes were based around a water feature of some sort, a pool. A static piece of water, sometimes activated with fountains and things, and that scenario carries through to this day. And I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to focus on instead is building projects, usually with a private or semi-private project, on a water body of some sort, on a pond, on a river, on a stream. Because they have a whole series of particular design and implementation issues that need to be addressed in order for those projects to be successful. So, for instance, these are all projects that are on rivers, or in one case on an ocean inlet. And they're all engaged, and the reason why they're there is because of the water body, and it's that interrelationship and that interface between the land and the water that makes them really special places. In order to understand water, you got to understand the hydrologic cycle, and kind of everybody, oh God, I got to put the hydrologic cycle up, back to earth science in high school, But it's important to understand that water and flowing cycle. Water flows. Water is an active, a dynamic system. You have to understand how much water and how quickly, and water usually deals with volumes, but they also deal with rates of movement. All your engineering calculations for pipe sizes and things all go back to amounts of flow. And it's very important to understand where your project is and what kind of volumes and what kind of flow rates have to move through your project, because you have to accommodate that. So your grading is built on moving water away or retaining water or infiltrating water. So it's really important to understand that water cycle, particularly to where your project is. So if you're in Arizona, you have a very different problem. You're trying to hold water and infiltrate it. You're trying to keep as much as possible. If you're in a place with flash floods, you have to be able to accommodate that flash flood through your project and not take everything else with it. If you have gentle rains within the hydrologic cycle where you are in that part of the world, you have to accommodate that. You have to know the hydrologic cycle for your particular site cold. So, for instance, in Indiana, the chart to the left is what you might expect for a 24-hour rain. The next one over are intensity. So you end up with, in any one particular site on the left, you might get, I think it's 3 1/4 inches. I can't read my own screen. But the next one shows that there are certain zones through Indiana that you would expect more rain, more volume, more water coming through there. They're wetter parts of the state. The next one to the right starts to show the interrelationship between the underlying soils and the water that might fall on them. Those are watersheds that are grouped by impermeability, based back generally on the soil charts. So if you've got a lot of water coming through and your site's mostly impermeable, things like infiltration aren't as feasible. You have to look then at schemes that run water through or much, much larger areas to accommodate the same amount of infiltration that you might on another site that was generally more permeable. You have to understand when you're working in a water-based landscape, where that landscape came from, how it evolved, because it gives you clues into where that landscape was, where it's moving to. You look at this kind of general, back to general earth science, the water in the meanders and the parts of the stream that are in scour, the other parts of the stream that might be in deposition. And these are dynamic systems, and if you're building in them, you have to know what they are and either accommodate them into your design to armor and to prevent them, or to accommodate them in your design in a dynamic element. This also gives you clues into floodplains. What parts of a site might be susceptible to flood. Gives you clues into soils. Gives you clues into what you can build and how you need to build. Then when the water falls on, it moves into the subsoil. And you have the interrelationship of the water at the surface and then the groundwater. And in between those two, there's that zone of capillary water that's available to plant growth. So because we're landscape architects and we're dealing with soil as a medium for growth and also as a medium for constructing hardscape, we need to be concerned with the groundwater and that area above the groundwater that has capillary water in it that's available to plants. So if that groundwater is too high, your plants die because your plants drown. If it's too low, they die for the other extreme. So being aware of that groundwater and how it interfaces with your plants in that capillary action where the groundwater is pulled up and is available to your plants is an important thing both at the macro scale and also at the micro scale. Oh, guys, trotting out the soil triangle. What is wrong with this guy? So everybody should know what that triangle is over there, the basic soil triangle and sand, silt, clay, and all that other kind of stuff. And for any soil, you can pick a spot with percentages. You should all know that from soil science. Now, the diagram on the upper right shows the relationship between a soil's strength and its moisture capacity and where it is. So and almost all of them have this kind of bell-shaped curve. And there's one sweet spot in there where it's not too wet and not too dry, where a soil is at its maximum strength. So you get a site where it's too saturated, it becomes softer. You get a site that's too dry, it becomes softer. You think about a beach on by the ocean, a beach on a big lake with some wave action to it. There's a sweet spot where the sand is wet, but not too wet and underwater, and not too dry, and that's where you can run. So that zone is where the optimum strength moisture ratio is for that particular sand. Yeah, on one side it's too wet, it's too soft. On one side it's too dry, it's too soft. Understanding that relationship between moisture and soil is important both in plant growth, but it's also important in structural stability. When you're dealing around water, the problem generally isn't not enough moisture, it's generally too much. And how you can deal with that is sometimes with under drainage. Now, farmers have used under drainage, drain tile, particularly in this part of the world, forever. And it's generally done, back once upon a time, it was done with clay tiles. Now it's generally done with plastic. Can be done also with swales to lower groundwater. So the diagram on the upper left is the typical kind of herringbone you would see in an agricultural field. But it's also used under turf areas, under play fields, and in the landscape where you have heavy soils and you want to keep the water moisture level down, to keep your strength up, and to keep that capillary zone down far enough so that you have enough root zone to support plant growth. The diagram on the lower left shows the relationship between the depth of those pipe and their spacing. So if you have fairly well-draining soils, you can make them deeper and farther apart. If you have to go shallow, you have to have them close together. So that's just kind of a qualitative thing. And the lower right shows a couple of different options of how that might be done. It could be done with a pipe, it could be done with fabric, it could be done with gravel. Under almost any detail you come up with, there's lots of different ways to do it, and there's generally picking the right one for your particular design comes into buildability, long-term sustainability of that detail, to have it function over time, the aesthetics, and various other things that you kind of bring to bear to pick the right solution. On the upper right, there's sometimes you deal with dry wells, sometimes you deal with massive infiltration. If you're dealing with infiltration as a primary drainage thing, you always need to design in an overflow, an emergency, some way so that when the soil is fully saturated, you've got another place for the water to go. Sometimes you want to deal with infiltration, and you want to deal with filtration of fines at the top and keep them at the top and keep them out of lower, more well-draining soils below. And you can do that with just a differentiation, having a very coarse soil, a coarse gravel, and going to finer and finer gravels as you move up. And what happens microscopically up on the top is that the finer soils kind of form these little bridges over the larger soils, and that's how the old composite drains used to work. And they're actually still used today a lot. A lot of times contractors will take shortcuts with fabrics, but it's actually a lot trickier and a lot less sustainable with fabrics because they can clog, whereas these drains tend not to. When you're dealing with marine environments, because of flooding and because of other movement within those, you need to deal with details that are robust, details that need to be strong enough for the intended purpose. On the right, this is a detail of a cavity wall. Most building walls are cavity walls where they'll have a structural component and then they'll have an air gap, air and moisture wicking gap, and then they'll have a skin of some sort. On the inside, there's probably other skins. That works great for buildings. It was developed for buildings. It allows you to have moisture separation between the inside and the outside. It allows for air movement. If that detail floods, you could have serious problems with failure. And in a landscape situation, that's not necessary. You can build solid on the outside. That air gap that's needed for a building to make habitable space isn't really needed for retaining walls and whatnot. So to pick the right kind of detail for a condition, say a flooding condition or a stream bed condition, you need to design something that's durable and strong enough. If you're dealing with moving water, you also need to deal with how that surface is going to interact with moving water. So for instance, on the left is a typical pool detail, whether it's swimming pool or ornamental pool, and it's oftentimes the designers will put in a line of tile right at the water level. And that's a durable and also maintainable solution. It's something you can, in fact, clean and keep clean. On the right is a reinforced vegetated slope that can stand up to periodic inundation and flooding, where the plants hold the soil for the most part, but there is an integrated plastic mesh of some sort that prevents blowouts and will make that edge sustainable. In your details for dealing with water bodies, where you have static water bodies or water bodies where the public might be involved, a lot of designers will incorporate a shelf so that if someone gets into a water body, a detention basin, say, they'll design in a shelf like this that gives people half a chance to get up and get out. So if that slope continued on, and if you're underwater and you're covered with silt that's slippery, somebody who gets into that basin has very little chance of getting out, particularly if they don't swim. Whereas a shelf like this gives them half a chance to get up and get out. So this is a safety concern. There's a flip side to this. By creating a shallow shelf here, you have lower, more shallow water area that plants can infiltrate into. So there's a trade-off between how that edge works, how vertical it is, how safe it's going to be, versus having deep enough water to keep out emergent aquatics. These are examples of static water, nearly static water. These are ponds. In the upper left is a garden from the 1800s in Dublin. It's a pond. It's a natural lower area that was expanded and made into a pond. It has a gently sloping side. You can see from the emergent aquatics coming in the back, with a deep spot in the middle and recirculating pump. Upper right is a project by Olmsted in Asheville. It's the Biltmore Estate, which has a combination of a hard edge with some depth to it to keep emergent aquatics out, and then a shallower edge in the back, which has shallower depths for emergent aquatics. On the lower left is a garden by Jenks in Scotland, which is extremely high maintenance, which having sod come right down to the water level. But this is basically a big sculpture, and sculpture in a park. But that interface between the static water at a static level and the grass is done and maintained through heavy, heavy maintenance. And then on the right-hand side is another armored edge, which is a project in Houston that has a stone edge that's easily maintained and easily drops off with a shelf to keep aquatic plants up. Those were all examples of static water. Moving water, if you have small watersheds, small velocities, small volumes of water moving through them, you can have just a very soft edge like the one in the left, a slow-moving stream. The other three examples are examples of armoring. The lower left is a fabric and planting solution with a plastic grid. On the upper right is a geogrid reinforced with riprap, and then the right are precast concrete pieces. So if you're in a watershed that has large fluctuations in water level and large volumes running through them, you have really fast velocities at the edge, and you need to armor the edge or they will erode. This is a project in Moline, Illinois. It's an old Sasaki project from the 1960s. It's the John Deere headquarters. And it's a very manicured landscape. Didn't start out that way, but John Deere sells lawnmowers. And what started out as kind of a natural landscape, gosh, they turned into turf. And it's turf down to a pond level, and you have all this mowed turf. Well, it's kind of unsightly to have that just kind of ragged at the edge. So this started out as a very natural, and if you go back to the plan, it's a very naturalistic looking plan. But over time, the maintenance here turned it into something quite different. So this edge was installed, this edge of stone was installed. There's an island with sculpture on it. But what started out as a very natural thing through owner's intervention turned into something very, very man-made in section that doesn't match the plan at all. Still pretty. This lousy picture is a corporate headquarters outside Cleveland. It was built for TRW. It's now the Cleveland Clinic. And this one has two interfaces with water. There's one here, which is a static pond, and one over here where a stream comes through and is imponded here. And then there's a weir and a second weir over here to maintain water underneath a bridge. So looking at this is the static pond by the building, which has a combination of soft edges and hard edges and deep water and shallow water to accommodate aquatics, and then the interface of land to water as more of a clean edge. But this is the bridge, and in the foreground you'll see the weir that backs up and creates the larger kind of kidney-shaped pond, and then there's another weir beyond the bridge which maintains a constant water level under the bridge. This was an intermittent stream that came and went, and the architect that was heavily involved in the bridge said, well, we got to have water under the bridge all the time. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we put in a couple of weirs and we'll dam it up. We'll leave it there. Even if it's not flowing, it'll have water over your bridge will make sense even in August. So there was this kind of curvy design that was put in, and you know, weirs that were supposed to look like they'd always been there. But it was done more by how it would look in plan and how it would look relative to the existing vegetation. You know, it swooped in and out and around some existing trees. And over the long term, it didn't really work very well, because the stream ran fast in the spring and then slowed way down, so you got a stream channel that was basically the old stream channel that was free flowing, and then you got deposition. You got, in essence, a sandbar that was built up over time through the middle of both of these, because there really wasn't the flow enough to keep all the particles active and moving through the system. So because of the nature, the reason it was designed was to hold water when there was low flow. Well, the low flow in and of itself created these bars, because the watershed upstream from this were some steep slopes that were heavily wooded, and heavily wooded by invasive, mostly Norway maples. So there was very little on the ground. So when you had storms, a lot of this resulted in stuff coming down into the watershed, and the watershed then creating this problem. When you design something you know, purely aesthetics without really getting back and studying the geomorphology of that watershed and those streams, you end up with stuff like this, which can be dug out and maintained, but maybe we should have done something else. So this is another corporate headquarters outside Dallas. This is Frito-Lay's headquarters. And this is out in the prairies outside Dallas. There was an existing farm pond here, which was built up. The dam was built up and repaired, and the pond went to about here. There was an intermittent stream that went through there, and there was a series of smaller ponds up here initially. And this is fairly flat until you got into the stream floodplain, basically. So the architects came out that we were working with, and the flat areas, of course, had all been farmed. You know, they'd been active fields, and the only places that weren't farmed were on the steeper slopes that went down to the floodplain. So the architect said, well, we'll build a building that's a bridge. So, okay, this is the kind of solution that would flunk you in a registration exam. This is, you made a big building right in the middle of a stream in a flash flood area. Okay, we can do that. You know, this doesn't make real, but okay, we can do it. Yeah, we're good designers. We can handle this. So, working with the engineers, they developed a massive flood conduit that goes right underneath the main lobby of the building and spills out underwater. And then the right-hand side over here is a bridge over here. So, you know, aesthetically, you have the water circulating in ponds upstream, and it disappears. You have a drop-off in the main lobby, and you have these hanging gardens and things that work down. You have your communal space, your cafeteria out in this bridge space that looks out to the out to the lake. And but in order to get there, you had to create a huge infrastructure under the building to make this work. So this is looking from the upper floors above the lobby, looking upstream. And you'll see just below that planting bed in the foreground is where all that conduit starts and all that water would flood through. And in order to keep this pristine, because this is an actively eroding watershed, some of the upper streams on the previous plan were kind of sacrificed as siltation basins. So they're all full of mud, but the storm water is allowed to settle out there and overflow and come down here relatively clean. So then looking back the other way during construction, that's the front lobby in there. In that big open area is the flood conduit that allows water to kind of pass through unobstructed. This is the construction of those gardens that are the center of the atrium of the building, built on the structure of the conduit. You can see the structure below here, where the water comes out in 4 barrels, and 2 are redundant, so if one gets clogged up, the other 2, so it's engineered and counter-engineered, and that's what it looks like when it was planted. So it's kind of the basis for this garden. It's a hot climate, so you have all that water evaporating here and pulling pulling the cool air up through the middle. So from that standpoint, it works, but they went to a tremendous expense to make it happen. Another picture, this is a picture of the cafeteria cross that's on the bridge that spans over. Another picture of that. This is the edges of what happened to the edges along the lake. And that's the spillway at the other end, which shows the capacity of the water that comes through here when you have the flash floods. This is Crissy Field. This is in San Francisco Bay. This is a project I worked with when I was at Hargraves. This area here used to be an old Army Air Corps base back in World War I and before. This was the Presidio, which is all a military base that's been redeveloped, so this is all new public access from the Golden Gate Bridge back into the city here. So the project consisted of a walk along the ocean here. There were beaches out in this portion here, a large grass strip there, a wetland that was developed in this zone here, parking in other buildings up as you go on. When it opened up to the public, it was mobbed from day one and is to this day. It's the one place you can go in this part of San Francisco and get down to the water. So it's very important to the city as public access was the main thing that was going on there. So you end up with this very wide promenade that on the weekends is full. And you end up at this particular point, it's out near the front, near San Francisco Bay. It gets a lot of wave action. There's heavy riprap there. Storm surge comes in. But as you, come back, okay, as you move in where that beach was, the beach takes the brunts of the storms, so you don't need that riprap as you move farther away, and you have that deposition of the beach, and that same promenade works through here. There's an inlet that comes in, so the tidal flow feeds the wetland that was created here. So, and there's a bridge that spans the wetland. So this is a combination of hard details and soft details, but it deals with that tidal flow. So the tides come in and they wash in and out of the wetland with very flat gradients, so that you don't get high velocities, you don't get scour. Parts of the shore are armored against storms, but all those were studied and only done in the areas where they were needed based on the hydrology of the bay. And this is looking over the wetland that was built from scratch over the bridge to the Golden Gate Bridge beyond. This is the River Seine in Paris. Very, very hard edge. The River Seine has tremendous variation in its flows. It varies, probably 7-8 meters in elevation through the course of the year. And there's a lot of opportunity to get down to the river, particularly in the center of the city. And it's all done hard, it's all done in stone, but it's ingenious in that they didn't do any detail twice, as it appears. So here you can see that this was in the spring in a flood time, but there's an access down here, a stairway up, another level here, and high water is up here somewhere. So at any point in the water, you can get down, or get down to a portion near the water and engage the water as a pedestrian. Here they have boat traffic on the Seine. This is fairly high water, and they have a series of ramps and stairs and another level up in here, all engaging the river at different flood levels to allow people to access. And one thing you notice is that when rivers flood, you get a lot of junk, and and when it goes down, that junk deposits. And this is fairly clean on a lot of other rivers, depending on if there was more of an agricultural watershed, this would be full of silt as well. But the Seine is fairly well developed, so you don't end up with a lot of active erosion, but you still get the junk. And this is another piece, the base of the Tour Eiffel. So this is a plaza, and you can tell that normally the water is down here someplace. It started up, but it can go up to here, and you get one relationship. It can even start up those stairs, and you still have access down to the river. And it's a very dynamic thing, and it's actually more interesting for having those level changes, and it's in a relationship with the river. This is Ray Street Pier in Philadelphia. It's a Jim Corner project. This was built on an old derelict pier, and piers tended to be put in level, dead level. So this was built on the structure of a pier, and so the basic structure that they rebuilt and built on had no topography to it at all. You end up with the river, fluctuating up and down, but you have a level datum to start with. So what the designers did to kind of break away from that and give some interest is they built up this portion here as a long ramp starting at the street, coming up to a promontory here with a series of steps and a ramp back down here with a grass area there. So as you move into the park, you have this procession of going up and up and up and up until you get to the end. Then you get a view of the river and you discover the rest of the park around the back. So on a very tough, level, structural slab, very narrow, they created a site with a lot of interest to it. But basically they're building on a concrete slab above the water. So they were in a relationship with the waters almost none. It's something to look at rather than interact with. So this on the right is a picture of when you come in and that rising deck that goes up. And on the left is the ramp that kind of goes back down on the other side. And this is the level grass area that you discover when you come up to the promontory. They do interact with the ducks somewhat, but the interaction with the water is something that's fenced off and kept away. So you have different scenarios when you design how much interaction you're going to allow for, how much you're going to use. So here it was fenced off as a safety separate thing. And this is the promontory at the top looking out on the river. This is, how am I doing time-wise? Oh, how much time we got? We got 2 hours? Okay, good. Just checking. This is Van Valkenburg's park in the Hudson. The plan is Manhattan's off the page up here. This is the Bronx. The Bronx Expressway comes through there. This is all old pier here. You get some derelict pier piles over in this section here. There's a sloping lawn that looks out to the river with Manhattan in the back. There's a ceremonial stair here to another promontory, another lawn that flows back off into this direction. And back over here, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's being developed with a carousel and little beach and whatnot. So this is where those pilings were from one of the old piers. It's kind of, the Hudson's heavily used. There's boats out in the Hudson and big boats, a lot. So the edges all tend to be very hard to withstand all of that, both that and the flows of the Hudson, because it's a big river, it's a monster watershed. But back in the lee of that flow line, when you get back in away from the edge, the water slows down a little bit. It isn't quite so bad. So back here, back in the lee of this, you can actually get down to the water some, whereas you can't really out towards the front of the channel. So back here is where there's ramps, where you can actually get down. You could launch, people launch kayaks out from this location in the Bronx. And they've done a lot with, riprap and somewhat softer materials. They've done planting into the riprap to soften it up because they can, because it's kind of in the lee of the flow. Flow on that plan was from right to left, just to give you some indication, because on flow direction is important. Particularly when you're dealing with rivers, because when the water's coming across, it's hard on the leading edge and soft and eddies on the trailing edge. So this is in the trailing edge. On the next eddy up, on the next inlet, there's even the water's moving slow enough to even create a little beach here with a carousel on this adjacent project. They've also introduced in this lee of the river flow rain gardens. So they have some areas here where they're cleansing some of the water and they're returning it back to the Charles, kind of in the folds between where you have the heavy intense use and the not so heavy use, and you have the slower flows where you can actually get this stuff coming back into the water. Then the main edge along the front is hard. You have it's hard, it drops to the water. You have a big open promenade where people can gather, and you have the New York skyline across the river. This is kind of looking downriver. New Jersey's kind of off just to the right. But you have a rail that keeps people out. It's a mesh, so it's nearly transparent, but it's a hard rail, and a hard, safe rail, whereas you didn't need it where things were flatter in the lee of the river. This is that green lawn that slopes down towards the river. I've never seen it when you could actually get out onto it. It's been loved to death. You get 20, 30,000 people on there, and it's so small, and the Bronx is so big that it's oftentimes roped off. It just can't put up with the traffic. There's just too many people, and it's just too small to accommodate them. So oftentimes it's closed. This is the promontory adjacent to the steps that's right across from Manhattan. So lots of opportunities to, when you're on the river, to look both at the river but also to look at the other shore. And this, because the other shore here is Manhattan, a lot of those views are directly across. In other places, you might want to take your views and run them downriver or upriver, but because you've got the Manhattan skyline, why not? Okay, now this is a project some of you may have seen. This is the Louisville waterfront park, which is just down the highway from here a bit. If you haven't been, you should go see it. It's a project I was involved in, was at Hargraves, and worked out a lot of details. Some were done by other people, but it's a project that's it's the Ohio River. North is up. And it's a linear park that starts very close in to the city, which is down here. There's a ballpark here. Humana's headquarters is here, parking garage, and all kinds of stuff that continues on upriver towards Cincinnati. And it gets progressively softer, but it's a continuous linear park that continues on and on and on up to marinas and all kinds of things upstream. This is what it looked like before the project started. It was an industrial site. As is a lot of rivers in the United States, the river was dominated by commerce. So there were warehouses and commercial buildings. They moved aggregate and bricks and things in and out of there. It was shipping, and between that and the interstate, the river was closed off to the people of Louisville. So when the businesses went defunct, this land became available, and the state, through a redevelopment authority, took it over and set out to redevelop it. But given its history, and given its history as an industrial site, it's a brownfield site. Not, as it turns out, not terribly brown, maybe kind of light tan. There was broken bricks and concrete and probably some asbestos and a few other odds and ends. But what was down there and under there wasn't something you wanted to have kids digging into in a sandbox. But overall, probably not so bad. And it perked pretty well because of all the broken bricks. So not a bad substrate to build a park on, all told. But this is kind of its, historically, this edge of the city had always been industrial, so they had no idea what was kind of under there when they started. So there were lots of precautions taken early on, assuming the worst, that this would be a terrible place you didn't want to get down into. That's the watershed of the Ohio. There's Indiana, there's Louisville, so that's kind of the watershed at this point. And the point is that it's big. There's a lot of water that runs through the Ohio at this point. And you can tell from the bridge over there that they regularly have really, really big floods. And so from day one, the designing for durability and maintainability through floods was an important consideration. And it was reflected in sections, material choices, in the plan, kind of, in the plant material choices, in setting up the maintenance regimes for taking care of the site. But it was a big deal on this particular site. Also, this is, became very early on the site for lots of stuff. Thunder over Louisville brings in thousands and thousands of people, and they stomp on every available square inch of site. And then they come in for concerts and do the same, and this comes shortly after flood season. So the maintenance down there is incredible, but it has to be usable. And the consideration early on was to create an infrastructure that would allow for this, allow for the flooding, allow for cleaning up the flooding, and for things to then be able to recover, you know, in a matter of months rather than years. And everyone who has experience, say, with play fields, and go seeing athletic fields, you get this kind of traffic. What does grass usually look like? Mud, yeah, it's lousy. But when you go down there, no, this looks pretty good. And a lot of that had to do with the detailing. It has also to do with the maintenance, which is tremendous down there. Fantastic, and would be worth a trip just to talk to the maintenance people. But it's it's large. It was paramount in the designers and detailers' minds from day one. This was an air photo of the site, the befores, and you can see some of the old warehouses and staging areas, and the site was basically in here, bounded by the bridge over the Ohio to Indiana in the north, and the Main Street Bridge over on this side. And then this area here all became redeveloped as a reaction to the park. So a lot of what the park's intent was to bring new development to Louisville, and it was very, very successful. So this was an early construction photo. They did a mass site package early on, which did mass grading for the whole site, took care of a lot of those broken bricks and things and put them all in piles roughly where they were supposed to be. And so before the finished surfaces went in, there was this mass grading contract that put things basically where they were supposed to be early on and took care of all the mitigation and the demolition. So when we started, it would look kind of like this. The main components of the plan are, on the left over here, there was a wharf extension. There was a tiny little wharf over here before, and there are riverboats and there are tours and things on the Ohio, and they needed more room. So the wharf was expanded in this triangular area here. There was an existing building here which became the Redevelopment Authority's office. There was a new restaurant that was put in over here. There was an element that was developed called the Festival Plaza. They went in right here. It was soft paving around here with a grass strip in there. Something that's important to note is that this is an elevated highway that goes through here. So these pieces, like the Festival Plaza, this blue stripe that's a fountain, this big green piece here called the Great Lawn slopes and goes down to the river underneath the highway. So it connects the main part of the town right down to the water and just flows right underneath the highway. And that was the main intent of this part of the park, was to make that strong connection back to the river and to get out, from under the barrier that the highway had been. This was a public garden. The garden groups do flower demonstrations and things there. And this was called the Linear Park. It goes in this next section up there. Now there is a remnant piece of the Great Lawn that's kind of over this other triangular piece. And the design idea was that it looked like there was a schism and it kind of floated off in that direction. And so it created an inlet here, a harbor for a marina, and then a similar move over on that side created a little inlet. So those are the main pieces of the design. And a lot of the design thinking and description was about these riverine kind of landforms, these invented words that kind of started when Hargraves was doing San Jose and was continued here. And they're the patented Hargraves berms, that snake around. It's everybody's. Anyway, that's, so here they're used, to create that linear park. 10 minutes? I'll move quicker, sorry. But the Ohio floods, and this is a fairly recent flood. This was the Great Lawn here. That's the harbor. Those are the inlets there. This is the overlook that comes out. There's the restaurant. That line of pylons is where the riverboats come. It floods. That picture in the upper right is what it looks like without the flood. So flood's a big deal. It floods even up to the bigger overlook. So these are kind of flood pictures everywhere. Flood's a big deal. And as you can tell, there's lots of stuff and lots of silt because the Ohio is actively eroding. So we built, so this is kind of the overall again. I'm going to hurry up and run through this a little faster. Here we go. So the Great Lawn, which is this big grassy thing that goes from the city down to the water, this is the grading plan for that and the other. So it's one continuous gradient. You know, if you want it to be one piece, it shouldn't have any kinks in it. So it goes from one mass gradient all the way down to the river. You know, it takes your eye down to the river. This is the planting plan that shows one big down the river. This is those little squares out on the Great Lawn are tents set up for events. But this is a picture at the ground. So it's this mass, you know, this big green swept going down, and it's mostly successful. Not so successful underneath the overpasses. There just isn't enough light to support good grass growth. They looked into supplemental lighting, and it was just outrageously expensive. It wasn't really feasible. So they reseed it with annual rye 2 or 3 times a year and sacrifice it that way to keep that level, but it's still not terrific. There's a hard edge on the right side where that little cutoff is, but it's used. It's lit at night, and it's used all the time. There's always people down there, pick up Frisbee, football games, always in use. You can go down there at 10 o'clock at night, it's full of people. So these areas show some of the surface treatments. The brown is the Great Lawn. In the left, you can see the Great Lawn has drains underneath it. The purple areas all have a material called decomposed granite, which is a soft material for walking on. And then the tan over there is a more basic planting thing. These show some of the engineer's details. Because it was potentially a brownfield site, they needed some sort of warning, some sort of separation between the subgrade and the finished grade coming in. So over every meter of the site is a warning grid. It's a fine, it's actually a fencing material. Sometimes you see them, they're like bird netting. So that was used over the entire site as a warning, so if you dug down, you'd know that the site below was potentially a brownfield. Here shows how the site would be stabilized. So it's some with grass, some with some with Curlex blankets, some with erosion control blankets. So this shows lower left is an anchor mat, which is a 3-dimensional plastic reinforcement that was used on slopes. The Curlex, which is the upper right, is a shaved aspen, which is used as biodegradable. Sometimes they were used in combinations, but these are used on all the slopes. But the Great Lawn itself was built from a material called net lawn, which are little plastic grids about the size of a playing card that are mixed into the soil fabric. And then as the roots go through, they stabilize it, and it acts just like reinforced concrete, like fiber reinforced concrete. And we looked at it. It was developed and used in racetracks. So, if you think about how much pressure a horse hoof exerts on turf, these were developed to still create a soft, resilient surface, but something that was really durable. So by using this, they can clean the silt off the Great Lawn with fire hoses without impacting it, and it keeps the lower levels of the soil profile from being overly compacted, and yet they can still come back in with aeration and service them. It's been a tremendous product. Then there's decomposed granite, which is a fine sieve material, soft, somewhat permeable, imported from California because they're California designers, but there's a great feel to it. Probably could have been finely crushed granite or limestone screenings here, but they wanted that. But in order for those two to work, both the decomposed granite and the net lawn, they need to be underdrained. So this is a copy of the underdrainage plan for the edge of the Great Lawn, which is here, and the overlook, which is here. And so all those light blue pipes are under drainage pipes, and they tie into mains, and they're taken right to the Ohio. This portion up here is all a wharf structure. So the end of the Great Lawn was extended beyond the existing shoreline to create that form, and it was done on concrete. So this is, I'm trying to move quick, so hopefully there'll be some questions. Yeah, this is the overlook, which is the larger piece that's looking over the Great Lawn. So you get a picture of that, and that's decomposed granite on the ground that's under-drained with that net below with bosks of trees. This is coming back farther, looking at that and what that looks like. So it's slightly rising as the Great Lawn is dropping, and you end up with stairs in the interim and stadium stairs that you go out and view what's going on in the Great Lawn. And what it looks like in the wintertime, what it looks like farther back, that same area at night and in the daytime. And this is the Festival Plaza that also heads for the water. So the idea is to bring people into the water and utilize these materials that were somewhat soft and easy underfoot. And then at night, with the downlights that create these circle patterns to create a nice space, you have the heavily lit Great Lawn, and then you have the lighter lit overlook, but both well lit and safe and well used. And then the seam between the two, and the seam between the two. Now, in addition to having old tree limbs and branches and trash and stuff, there's also heavy barge traffic in the Ohio. And on occasion, those barges get loose. So the edge pieces that were designed, for the most part, can you read that? Anyway, that edge piece that I showed you that was beyond the under drainage plan was supported by piles, which they drove down into the ground and poured a concrete deck over. And for the most part, this is how they were designed. But in a couple of areas that stuck out into the Ohio, that would be susceptible to damage by the barges, there was a system developed by the engineers which had, well, all these walls, this shows it during construction, all these walls were limestone panels that were set over precast concrete pieces. But in section, you ended up with all this poured in concrete, all this tannage concrete. There was a precast angle that was installed, massive. You know, it's 12, 14 feet high and 14 feet across, filled up with concrete, and in between was a big rubber bumper. So what happens when a barge hits this, it slides in and hits the concrete slides across this base. The bumpers, which are set up in pairs like this, flex and then give out. So the damage is confined to just that front. So they can come back and push it back in place and resheath it in limestone without destroying the whole thing or destroying the barges. So this detail was a function of that heavy barge traffic on the edge. Then there's a fountain that starts as a source fountain with the standard jets out of the ground kind of thing. And then it flows down into a series of pools, and that funny looking metal thing there is a jet. And the jets flow from one pool to the other pool all the way down to the river. So this is at night, the jets are lit, and they come off intermittently, explode from one pool to the other, and they're lit up in the side. It's pretty cool. And this is looking back. So there's paths that cross over the fountain, and they fall from triangular basins down to other triangular basins on their way to the river. And this is kind of along that edge, along that weir, so it's very active coming down the weir. And then end up, then it's captured, but it appears as though it runs right into the river. It's captured and recycled, but the design intent is it looks like it's flowing in as part of the river. This is the linear park, so a few more minutes. How are we doing? Okay, all right. The linear park, which is, here's an air photo, and it kind of looks like this. It's very soft and has lots of seams and zones of heavy planting, tremendous views back to the city. Now this is an area where, in Van Valkenburg's park, when you look straight across, you're looking at Manhattan, and that's terrific. Here, you're looking back at southern Indiana, which has a Days Inn and a couple of other not so hot stuff. The really beautiful views are back to the city or downriver. So the landscape is set up to create these views and these visions of the opening up lawns that go askew, not across. So the whole linear park is about that. And it was built up much the same way with stabilized planted slopes and and whatnot. Here's a grading plan and a planting plan. The planting plan shows the landforms that are very steep along these two edges, here and here and here and here, and then flat around there and flat around there. So the views then kind of come out this way and this way and this way, all down river, and down to the bridges that are downriver. So you, within that very narrow section between the highway and the river, you have lots of up and down, lots of different spaces, and they knock out the sound one from the other. This is a plan which showed how the different slopes were stabilized and how much soil they were under them. There was a series of details that were developed for planting along. This is the engineer's section for the river edge, and there was a line, 3 lines of gabions that were set in, and then a geogrid, which was backfilled with large stones. And then you had either planting or you had asphalt paths. This was the planting plan that corresponded with that. So you had, here are the gabions that were largely underwater. They took all the brunt of the day-to-day river traffic and the water at the edge. And then as you moved up, the stones and the geomesh were, took a lot of the brunt of it, but then we were interplanted. We interplanted with, well, in some places we interplanted with trees cut out in very small caliper, but in trees that could take the inundation. We had some emergent aquatics low. We also had some live fascines. So we went out and collected live cuttings of predominantly willows and alders, riverside plants, and stuck them in green, and they rooted. So this is kind of the geoweb fabric, and you put the stone in, and it's really hard to dig in this stuff. It is nearly impossible to dig this stuff out. You almost have to toss the stones out. So the live fascines, which are basically driving in these sticks, worked really well, but the other stuff didn't. So this is a picture shortly after planting, and you can see all the sticks in here, the green sticks, and you see all the trash that came down and captured. But over time, those edges, this was, I think, 1.5 years later. So a lot of that's filled up. And this is 4 years later. So a lot of those things that started as live cuttings then came in. And this became also tremendous wildlife habitat, just full of all kinds of stuff. Typical planting details. On the left is how trees used to grow when I was your age. Which was kind of like, that's how we thought trees grew in 1970s. So the planting details look kind of like this slope-like thing like that. And now we think trees grow like that, and planting details kind of respond to that. So for instance, all the details here had to respond to the soil conditions. So on the upper left shows a series of under drainage for all the plants that were going to be inundated in the flood, so you had to get the water off of them so they didn't drown. So there's a series of under drains in plan. It's picked up in section here. There's another under drain here. Even in the planter beds out there for the community gardens are under drained to be able to get once the water is down, to get the water away so it didn't stay saturated. Planting on slopes. We had very large trees that were planted on the slopes. We came up with a detail. We could set out level benches and put a large caliper tree into the slope, and then come back and fill it with very open graded material above the ball. And this shows something shortly after planting on those same slopes. So the trees were doing great at the time. One more point and we'll be done. This is, the plan kind of took into account a lot of the activities of the river, but some of it were more aesthetic moves. And one of the aesthetic moves was this cut and this cut. And this picture was taken probably 7, 8 years into it. And you could see that there's an awful lot of stuff that went into that inlet and never came out. So for instance, and then years later, that disappeared altogether. It became grass. This over here, because it's a marina and they, there's traffic in and out, and they rent those slips, it's worth it to them to keep that clean. But this one never was. Now, when you look at the larger scale of when those kind of landforms happen, they usually happen at the mouth of streams. streams come out and they keep that clear. Well, that didn't happen in this case. Oops, wrong one. I get this one. This is a copy of the storm drainage plan. And we have an interstate highway up there with major water coming out. And all the drains go right straight to the river. None of them feed these inlets. So had this been directed here and had some of this been directed there, maybe even some of this directed there, that might have kept it flushed. But we'll never know. That occurred to us too late in the process to do anything about. So that's all I got. Sorry I'm late. Thank you all. So, questions? Anybody got any questions? Good. Thank you. Jody, you're going to take this around? Anybody's got any questions?
Take it around.
Okay.
So, questions? Can I offer a mic? Yeah.
So you've worked with some pretty high-profile designers. Can you talk about how you have worked with them to link their design ideas and the implementation that you help them with?
Well, part of it was just dumb luck and not being able to hold a job. I worked for a lot of different places early in my career. I'm being facetious, sorry. I had the opportunity to work with a lot of people early on who went to other offices and knew I was good at what I did and brought me along. So, Jody and I were taught by Pete Walker once upon a time. So I worked with Pete. I worked with Martha Schwartz early on. She brought me in to consult, 15, 20 years later. When I was a principal at Hargraves, I had people working for me that went off to other offices and brought me in when they had tough problems. But I've been fortunate to be able to work with really good designers and have my area of expertise that would reinforce what they were doing. All good designers are interested in construction. They're interested in how their work gets built, and that their work is built well, and that it holds up. The worst thing you can do is come up with a great plan and then have it built and say, why did they do that? Or have it 2 years later ripped out. So I kind of built a sub-practice on being able to go in and consult and work the construction process, work the documentation process, and work the construction administration process to keep the designs alive. I had to beat up on engineers to say, well, have you ever thought about doing it this way? Or why can't we do that? And be able to go into the numbers with them and say, well, there's these products that work, and here's their performance criteria, and why won't this work? And most of the time I win. I've been lucky. But it's part of implementation is part of the design process. And you have to engage, and you have to know to do a set of documents, say, or to do construction administration. You've got to know what was on the conceptual plan. You have to know what the design's all about, first and foremost. And doing documents isn't an abstract exercise. It's the tail end of design. It's where you get your real nuance and where stuff really works and hopefully gets better. It will change, and hopefully it gets better in the process. And I've been lucky to work with some people that saw that value, and I could work back and forth and talk about design ideas and bring other ideas, implementation ideas to the table that reinforce what they were trying to do or made it better as opposed to make it dumber.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else on this level? Upstairs? Okay, well, we have a small reception for Tom up on the second floor. He will be available. He's going to be giving critiques to the students from third year and fourth year. So you're welcome to come up. I'd like to thank Tom for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A little bit of frivolousness.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we'll see you all upstairs. Thank you very much.